They say behind every great man is a great woman. Behind every dead president is a dead first lady.
That's just it. And we're going to learn about the top 5 first ladies here on the Dead Presidents Podcast this week.
5. We're about to take a dive. 4. In the presidential lore. 3. Who will fuck like me? 2. We're about to tell you. 1. Let's go down the gun.
Hello and welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
And we've got another great top 5 for you this week. We're going to be talking great women in history.
There's been a lot of great first ladies. A lot of different ways to look at the office of First Lady, which has changed a lot over the years.
Indeed it has.
Some First Ladies have shined pretty brightly.
That's just it. And today, we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 First Ladies.
Number 5.
Jacqueline Kennedy.
Born Jacqueline Bouvier in New York in 1929 to a wealthy family. Though her parents did divorce when she was young, she grew up in Manhattan, educated at elite private schools where she was near the top of her class. She learned French, Spanish, and Italian, became a skilled equestrienne. She attended Vassar College, studied abroad in France, and graduated from George Washington University in 1951. She was working as a photographer for the Washington Times-Herald when she met Congressman John F. Kennedy, a very eligible bachelor who was running for Senate at the time. They were married in 1953.
After a miscarriage and a stillbirth, she had their daughter Caroline in 1957 and was pregnant again during her husband's 1960 presidential campaign. Her pregnancy prevented her from participating much in the campaign, though she did write a weekly newspaper column and cut a Spanish-language campaign ad. She was the subject of intense media interest and was already becoming a fashion icon. 2 weeks after JFK won the presidential election, Jackie gave birth to JFK Jr. In the White House, the young, attractive Kennedy family captured the public imagination, and as First Lady, Jackie is going to garner worldwide attention. She becomes a fashion trendsetter and hires her own fashion designer. She is the First Lady to have her own press secretary, and she receives such positive and admiring coverage that it has been said that she, quote, created an unrealistic media expectation for First Ladies that would challenge her successors.
That's right, Jackie Kennedy, a rock star of a First Lady, setting a high bar. She also oversaw a major restoration of the White House, creating the White House Historical Society, and she tracked down many old historic furnishings and helped secure an act of Congress that preserved White House furnishings as possessions of the Smithsonian. In 1962, Jackie hosted a televised tour of the White House that was broadcast on CBS and watched by over 80 million viewers, and for which she won an Emmy Award.
Pretty
Believed the
impressive
only
stuff.
First Lady to win an Emmy.
Indeed.
She also visited many foreign countries with and without her husband and received adoration around the world, especially impressing those in French and Spanish-speaking countries with her fluency in their languages.
That's right. In France, she negotiated to have the Mona Lisa exhibited in the United States. She often outshined the president, with JFK once joking, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I have enjoyed it." As First Lady, Jackie visited France, Britain, Italy, Greece, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Morocco, Turkey, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and more. Much of her time, however, is spent taking care of her 2 young children, and she becomes pregnant again whilst First Lady. In August 1963, she gives birth to a son, Patrick, by emergency C-section. As recounted on our top 5 tragic presidential child deaths, Patrick was 5 weeks premature and died when he was less than 2 days old.
Very tragic.
Indeed.
But the young first family and the first lady, who is a mother to young children, capturing the public imagination. They love Jackie. And Jackie's tragedy, of course, just beginning, because just over 3 months after the death of young Patrick, Jackie was beside her husband when he was assassinated in Dallas. She would refuse to change out of her blood-stained pink suit for the occasion of LBJ's swearing in. She told Lady Bird Johnson that she, quote, wanted them to see what they have done to Jack. She planned her husband's state funeral, modeling it after that of Abraham Lincoln. A week after the assassination, she gave an interview for Life magazine in which she compared the Kennedy White House to King Arthur's mythical Camelot, saying, quote, there will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot.
That's it. A British commentator observed, quote, Jacqueline Kennedy has given the American people one thing they have always lacked: majesty. Later, Jackie would marry the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis from 1968 until his death in 1975. Thereafter, she worked as an editor for Viking Press and Doubleday. She died in 1994 at the age of 64 and was buried beside JFK in Arlington National Cemetery.
Well, Jackie Kennedy, a very famous first lady, dealt with a lot of things.
That's it.
Endured a lot of tragedy. Displayed strength and fortitude in the face of losing not only a child, but losing her husband in a horrific manner.
That's it. And James, you know, it takes a remarkable kind of woman to deal with the sore neck that results from always having to look the other way when it comes to the infidelity of her husband, as we've mentioned on a previous Top 5.
That's right, JFK, the #1 presidential adulterer.
Jackie had to go through an awful lot, and her stoicism and quiet dignity, perhaps, to borrow from the British Observer, majesty, made her a remarkable first lady and garnered her the 5 spot.
Yeah, despite all this she dealt with, she still portrayed this kind of perfect image, and everyone loved her. I think I read someone commented who had known her, compared her to being with her was like seeing a great tragic actress, but in like the best sense of that term.
Well, there you have it, Jackie Kennedy, and we'll see who's coming up next on this, our Top 5 First Ladies.
Number 4.
Sarah Polk.
Sarah Childress was born in 1803 to a prominent Tennessee plantation family. She's highly educated at private boarding schools and at the Moravian Female Academy in North Carolina. And then through the encouragement of a mutual family friend, Andrew Jackson, she was courted by James K. Polk. They were married in 1824. They were never to have children, possibly as a result of Polk's childhood gallbladder surgery, which may have left him sterile. But that's going to leave both him and Sarah free to focus on his political career.
That's just it. Polk was embarking on a political career at the time of his marriage, and Sarah excels as a political wife. She is lively, intelligent, and a good conversationalist, with her grace and charm compensating for Polk's often austere manner. She would become his closest advisor, and she works behind the scenes to organize his campaigns, serving as the unofficial campaign manager of his Tennessee gubernatorial campaigns. Now, if you'll remember from episode 11, there's a lot of work that goes into that. She is keeping as busy as he is, traveling the state, making speeches. She helps to edit those speeches and clips newspaper articles that she thinks he ought to read. Polk stated, quote, "None but Sarah knew so intimately my private affairs." Now, Sarah's not really interested in a domestic role, saying she would, quote, "neither keep house nor make butter, but would always take a deep interest in state and national affairs."
That's right, and she would shine on the Washington, D.C. social scene her husband spending many years in Congress, and Sarah, as wife of the Speaker of the House, would host guests from all parties, both political opponents and supporters. And then as First Lady, she would be very well liked and very well respected, and was a popular social hostess despite her staunch Presbyterian values. She didn't drink alcohol, she didn't dance or attend the theater or racetrack. She strictly observed the Sabbath, but she hosted 2 weekly evening receptions at the White House, and her parties were more elegant and dignified affairs than the flashy waltzes and polkas thrown during the brief reign of her predecessor, Julia Tyler.
That's right. Sarah discusses politics with the most eminent politicians of her time, such as Polk's rival Henry Clay, and she was known to be politically outspoken, though publicly she often masked her own strident opinions by prefacing them with, quote, "Mr. Polk believes." When Polk contracted cholera and died 3 months after leaving office, his last words were, quote, "I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you." Sarah Polk would wear black for the remaining 42 years of her life, the longest widowhood of any First Lady.
During the Civil War, she maintained loyalty to the Union and entertained many Union generals, but she held herself above the fray, and her home in Tennessee was respected as a neutral ground. She also entertained Confederates and had sympathy for and provided aid to suffering Confederate families. She was described as, quote, "a true woman and a strong woman, true to all the best feelings of a warm and honest heart, strong in all that belongs to a cultivated mind and a brave one. She had strength of purpose, a clear intellect, and was a wise and sagacious student of affairs, not only because she had the mind to comprehend and appreciate, but also because she tenderly revered the memory of her husband, who had been honored with the highest gifts by the people of his country. She was a great woman, and few have lived like her, for she has passed unscathed through an ordeal that few women and men, living or dead, could have passed, and left a bright record behind them." She died in 1891 at the age of 87.
That's it. And she entertained Grover Cleveland at her home at one point. Hung in there quite a while.
Wow.
And, pretty remarkable for her time in terms of the political astuteness. I think only Abigail Adams rivals that. And as a matter of fact, that's going to bring us to who's next on our top 5 First Ladies.
Number 3.
Abigail Adams.
What a coincidence.
Indeed. Abigail Smith is born in Massachusetts in 1744. She receives no formal education, but her mother taught her to read and write, and she educated herself through extensive reading from the large libraries of her family members. In 1764, she married the lawyer and future president John Adams and would go on to have 6 children, the second being future president John Quincy Adams.
When her husband entered politics during the Revolution, Abigail became his closest and most trusted advisor. In 1776, while he was serving in the Continental Congress, she urged him to, quote, "remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation."
There you have it. Abigail Adams. Strong words from a strong woman. Abigail would argue in favor of women's education, saying, quote, "If you complain of neglect of education in sons, what shall I say with regard to daughters, who every day experience the want of it? I most sincerely wish that some more liberal plan might be laid and executed for the benefit of the rising generation, and that our new Constitution may be distinguished for encouraging learning and virtue. If we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women."
Indeed. And Abigail certainly was one such.
That's it.
She would also speak in favor of the abolition of slavery.
Way ahead of her time on this point.
Yep, saying, quote, "I wish most sincerely there was not a slave in this province. It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have."
Yeah. A wise woman is Abigail Adams. In 1783, Abigail joins her husband in Paris during his diplomatic service there, and in 1785 during his service as the first U.S. minister to Britain, where she and her husband were received by King George III himself. When John Adams was elected president in 1796, Abigail wrote that she expected, quote, "to be vilified and abused for continuing to speak her mind." Quote, "I have been so used to freedom of sentiment that I know not how to place so many guards about me as will be indispensable, to look at every word before I utter it, and to impose a silence upon myself when I long to talk."
Well, as First Lady, she continued to be the most trusted advisor, this time of the president, and stayed involved in political issues. She circulated letters to family and friends encouraging the spread of information favorable to the administration. She served as hostess of official functions at the presidential residence in the capital of Philadelphia at the time. But because the president had to pay for entertaining out of his own pocket at that time, her functions were rather austere. She was unabashedly partisan in favor of the Federalist Party and drew criticism from the opposition, with Albert Gallatin referring to her as, quote, "Her Majesty" and "Mrs. President, not of the United States, but of a faction."
Wow.
Abigail, not taking that line down, she shot back her own criticisms of the, quote, "sly, artful, and insidious Gallatin." And in the last 4 months of the administration, the Adamses moved into the White House in the new capital of Washington, D.C., where Abigail famously hung her laundry out to dry in the empty and unfurnished East Room.
That's just it. After her husband's presidency, she reaches out to their former friend Thomas Jefferson to express sympathy over his daughter's death, opening the door to the reconciliation that led to the famous Adams-Jefferson correspondence in later life. Abigail helped raise several of her grandchildren, taking care of John Quincy's sons while he served as ambassador to Russia. She also nursed her daughter Nabby, who died from breast cancer in 1813. Abigail herself died in 1818 at the age of 73 from typhoid fever. Her last words were, quote, "Do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend. I am ready to go. And John, it will not be long." There you have it, Abigail Adams. Quite similar to Sarah Polk, but even more ahead of her time.
Yep. Yeah, Abigail a little bit more outspoken and in your face about it.
That's
Sarah
it.
Polk a little bit more skilled at keeping her machinations behind the scenes.
That's
But
right.
Abigail, certainly quite a woman and really the perfect foil to her husband. Just the kind of woman he needed to keep him in line, keep him honest, and give him advice.
Absolutely. And we'll see who that leads us to as we proceed on this, the Top 5 First Ladies.
Number 2.
Dolly Madison.
Born in 1768, Dolly Payne grew up on a farm in Virginia where her Quaker father emancipated his slaves. Her family moved to Philadelphia when she was 15, and in 1790 she married a lawyer, John Todd, and had 2 sons. Of course, she would go on to achieve fame serving as First Lady to President Todd. Nope, actually, in 1793, a yellow fever epidemic killed John Todd and Dolly's youngest son.
That's just it.
A devastating epidemic. Senator Aaron Burr stepped in to provide her with legal help in collecting her inheritance from her late husband's estate, and he also introduced her to his bachelor friend, leading Congressman James Madison.
Indeed. And James Madison, and her are going to be married in 1794 when she was 26 and he was 43. A 17-year age gap that landed Madison on our top 5 presidential cradle robbers. Now, Dolly enters the social circle of the nation's leaders, and she is a hit. She's charming, vivacious, and fond of the low-cut French fashions that Abigail Adams called, quote, an outrage upon all decency. She was a major political asset for Madison because she was everything he wasn't. This is becoming a trend here. Madison is shy and awkward, whereas she is fun and charismatic. She's the life of the party, and she throws great parties. The federal capital moves to Washington, D.C. just months before Madison becomes Secretary of State in the new Jefferson administration, and Dolly will soon become the center of the new Washington social scene.
That's right. Jefferson was a widower, and while his daughter occasionally served as White House hostess, Dolly Madison often took on that role herself. She entertained congressmen and diplomats and helped Madison make friends and spread his influence. In 1808, when the Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus chose Madison as the party's presidential nominee over his potential rival James Monroe, Dolly's influence was a factor. As one Madison biographer put it, quote, Dolly's dinner guests were thus the electorate that would decide on Madison's nomination. All the dinner parties in the world could not have boosted a nobody, but Dolly's did their bit to lift her already prominent husband. Madison became president, and Dolly became the first lady to decorate the White House, which was still relatively bare and empty after the 8 years of the bachelor widower Thomas Jefferson living there in rather lonely conditions. Dolly acquires new wallpaper, furniture, and china, working within a tight budget to achieve an elegant appearance that also meshed with the ideal of Republican simplicity.
Indeed. She would also hold weekly Wednesday night receptions where, as Washington Irving said, she had, quote, a smile and pleasant word for everybody. One journalist remarked on, quote, the ease with which she glided into the stream of conversation, and how admirably the air of authority was softened by the smile of gaiety. And it is pleasing to recall a certain expression that must have been created by the happiest of all dispositions, a wish to please, and a willingness to be pleased. This, indeed, is to be truly good and really great. Wow. Henry Clay would also say, quote, everybody loves Mrs. Madison. That show, unfortunately, never got picked up.
Nope. That would be quite a sitcom. Future President Martin Van Buren would say, quote, Mrs. Madison is the most brilliant hostess this country has ever known. During the War of 1812, however, social entertaining was brought to a halt. Nevertheless, Dolly still managed to shine in one of the most famous episodes in First Lady history.
Indeed.
The season finale of Everybody Loves Mrs. Madison.
Right, the exciting season finale. And it ends on a cliffhanger, but it never got picked up.
After routing the American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg in nearby Maryland, the British Army marched on Washington. President Madison had already fled, and federal employees were packing up government records and running away. Dolly Madison stays behind to pack up the White House, and she refuses to leave until she had saved the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, ordering that its frame be broken so that it can be removed to safety. The British burned the White House the next day. The Madisons would live elsewhere for the rest of his term while it was being rebuilt.
That's it. They retired to Virginia, but after Madison's death in 1837, Dolly moves back to Washington and rejoins the social scene. In 1844, she's present aboard the USS Princeton when its cannon explodes, killing 6 men, including the Secretary of State and Secretary of the Navy.
As our listeners recall from the John Tyler episode.
That's right. In 1849, she was photographed alongside President Polk, First Lady Sarah Polk, future President James Buchanan, and his niece, future First Lady Harriet Lane. When she died in 1849 at the age of 81, President Zachary Taylor eulogized her by saying she was, quote, the first lady of the land for half a century. It was perhaps the first time the term First Lady was applied to a president's wife, but it would not become the official title for the sitting president's wife until some time later. Dolly Madison, truly exemplifying the role of First Lady.
Yes, certainly during the earlier years when the First Lady's primary role was social hostess, no one was better at that than Dolly Madison.
That's it. And when it came time for action, she knew what to do.
Yeah. Between her there and Jackie Kennedy during the assassination, few instances when First Ladies have to display courage under fire.
I
And
don't think Julia Tyler would have been worrying about a Washington portrait if the British were advancing.
perhaps not.
And that's going to bring us down to, last but not least, on our list of this, the top 5 First Ladies.
Number 1.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt, born in 1884 to a prominent New York family. But when she was 9 years old, her mother died of diphtheria, and when she was 10, her father, Theodore Roosevelt's alcoholic brother, Elliot Roosevelt, died from a seizure after jumping out of a window. As our listeners will recall from the top 5 most embarrassing presidential brothers.
Yes, the embarrassing situation where an alcoholic had a seizure after leaping from a window.
Well, that was the tragic end.
Indeed.
The embarrassing situation where he was impregnating a maid and
Yeah,
scandalizing his family,
that's it.
preceding that. That's how Eleanor grew up.
Indeed.
And then she would go on to be raised by her maternal grandmother, and she would excel in her private school education and go on to become active in charity and social work, joining the Junior League and volunteering as a teacher for immigrant children.
In 1902, she began a courtship with her 5th cousin once removed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they married in 1905, with her uncle, President Teddy Roosevelt, giving away the bride. Eleanor gave birth to 6 children by 1916, and her husband embarked on a political career. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1918 when Eleanor discovered letters proving he was having an extramarital affair with Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's own social secretary, as our listeners will no doubt recall from our top 5 presidential adulterers. Eleanor, of course, was devastated, and Franklin considered leaving her for Lucy, but his mother threatened to disinherit him if he did so. They would stay together, but Eleanor never forgave him, and thereafter she pursued her own interests, while their marriage became a political partnership.
That's right. She focused on social work, and he ran unsuccessfully for vice president in 1920. In 1921, he was stricken by polio, and she stayed by his side, faithfully nursing him and encouraging him to continue with his political career over the objections of his mother, who wanted him to retire. While he recovered, she made political appearances on his behalf, advocating for a 48-hour work week, a minimum wage, and the abolition of child labor. In 1924, she campaigned for Democrat Al Smith for governor of New York against her first cousin, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., opening a rift between the Oyster Bay and Hyde Park branches of the Roosevelt family.
That's just it. In 1928, Franklin is elected governor of New York, and in 1932, president of the United States. Eleanor was initially depressed about being First Lady, whose role was seen primarily as a social hostess, but she was determined to break the mold. With her husband's support, she continued and expanded her political activism, which would ultimately involve her speaking and lecturing around the country, holding regular press conferences, writing a daily syndicated newspaper column and regular magazine articles, hosting regular radio programs, and speaking at the Democratic National Convention. In 1932, President Hoover had been lambasted for sending the Army to violently disperse the Bonus Army, a protest group of First World War veterans seeking early payment of promised bonuses. But When a similar bonus army reappears in 1933, Eleanor visits their camp unaccompanied, listening to their concerns and winning their admiration, with one veteran remarking, quote, "Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife."
And what a wife she was.
Indeed.
Eleanor would support the formation of the National Youth Administration, a New Deal agency focusing on providing work and educational opportunities for young Americans. She also spent a great deal of time and a lot of her own money supporting the ultimately unsuccessful planned community of Arthurdale, West Virginia, where the federal government resettled unemployed miners and farmers. She also supported civil rights, inviting many African American guests to the White House, arguing that government programs should benefit citizens of all races, resigning in protest from the Daughters of the American Revolution when it refused to host a black singer, and lobbying for a bill to make lynching a federal crime, which didn't pass in part because her husband refused to support it.
But Eleanor, on the right side of history here. Upon the American entry into World War II, Eleanor speaks out against anti-Japanese American prejudice and is heavily criticized for her stance. She also privately opposes her husband's executive order establishing Japanese American internment camps. She is an early advocate for women taking factory jobs in war industries, and she writes a short film that outlines ways women can help with the war effort. Eleanor's marriage continues to be a non-romantic political partnership, with FDR having affairs with women, and Eleanor likely also having affairs with women, especially her close friend, journalist Lorena Hickok. After FDR's death, Eleanor helped turn their Hyde Park estate into a museum and presidential library. President Truman appointed her as a delegate to the United Nations, where she became the first chairperson of the UN Commission on Human Rights and helps to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She would go on to publish more than 24 books, including her autobiography, and she would continue to work tirelessly on behalf of national and international causes until her death in 1962 at the age of 72.
Wow.
Eleanor Roosevelt, truly a great First Lady, taking all the right stances, trying to do as much as she can. She's really going above and beyond.
Yeah, she definitely totally redefined the office of First Lady.
Absolutely.
And First Ladies thereafter have done more to speak out for causes and work on behalf of humanitarian efforts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Eleanor, yeah, she was a very independent woman. It's kind of a strange situation how her marriage at the time was not really a traditional marriage anymore, but that really freed her up to do a lot of other good things.
That's right.
And there were even times where she took stances against her husband's stances.
Yeah, and I think she was right on those particular stances in which she disagreed with him.
Mm-hmm.
She probably would have made a great president herself, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yep, and then, going on to chair the Human Rights Commission, I don't know if that's the first time that a First Lady would go on to hold a official post in her own right.
Yeah.
It could have been.
Yeah, I mean, she's truly championing some causes here.
Mm-hmm.
A remarkable First Lady indeed, which is why she garnered our top spot here. But of course, we do have some honorable mentions.
Yeah, it was hard to narrow it down. There are a lot of First Ladies that deserve recognition. A lot of them could have arguably been in this top 5, but we have a lot of honorable mentions as well.
That's it. And we'll begin at the beginning with Martha Washington, who said, quote, "I live a very dull life here and know nothing that passes in the town. I never go to any public place. Indeed, I think I am more like a state prisoner than anything else. There are certain bounds set for me which I must not depart from, and as I cannot do as I like, I am obstinate, and stay at home a great deal."
Yep, Martha Washington, the First Lady, establishing the office and the first to feel the constraints of it.
Yeah.
Having to act in that very public role and present this image that's very dignified but also democratic. The Washingtons chose to not attend like private dinners while he was president, so that they would maintain this like official stance. And Martha, the first one to serve as the social hostess, she kind of inaugurated that role, holding the levees. And
Yeah, but she probably didn't get as much notice as her husband, whom ladies would be lining up to have a dance with.
yeah, well, she stayed true to her role and to her husband, and was pretty well praised. I think by the end of Washington's administration, when he was receiving some more criticism, Martha would also come in on that when the more Republican side was claiming that there was like monarchical airs going on with, kind of the dignity of their entertaining. It's a very tough line to walk in a world where, the diplomats and everybody, when they think of the head of state, they're talking about kings, and the way that those, the court functions is a monarchical court. And then Martha and her husband having to recreate that, but in a democratic and Republican way.
Sure. I mean, when you're the first of anything, you're talking about precedents, and Martha Washington setting the precedent for the role of the First Lady.
Mm-hmm. She also had some wise words to offer. As she wrote in one letter, quote, "I have seen too much of the vanity of human affairs to expect felicity from the splendid scenes of public life. I am still determined to be cheerful and to be happy in whatever situation I may be. For I have also learnt from experience that the greater part of our happiness or misery depends upon our dispositions and not upon our circumstances. We carry the seeds of the one or the other about with us in our minds wheresoever we go."
Pretty good words. Martha Washington. Worthy of an honorable mention here. As is Francis Cleveland, about whom the New York Times wrote, quote, "Other presidents have shared the executive mansion with wives whose personal attractiveness, accomplishments, wit, and tact have commanded admiration, but in not one of all the wives of all the presidents have the whole people manifested more interest than they do in the present lady of the White House. Her youth, beauty, grace, animation, and unaffected cordiality are irresistible." And that was true. Frances Cleveland.
That's right.
A big hit.
She was kind of the Jackie Kennedy of her day.
Indeed.
Kind of maybe the only other first lady that's really comparable to Jackie Kennedy in the way that the public was just fascinated by her. Of course, our listeners will recall from the Cleveland episodes and the top 5 presidential cradle robbers.
That's right.
That Frances Cleveland was just 21 years old when she married the sitting president in the first White House wedding of a sitting president.
Indeed.
And thereby capturing the national imagination. A young, attractive, educated woman who would then go on to have children as First Lady during her second term. I think she and Jackie Kennedy are the only First Ladies to have children while in office. She was also kind of taken up as a fashion icon, and people trying to use her name and image in advertisements without consent.
That's it.
And also kind of softening the image of her husband, who was a little bit more standoffish and impenetrable, but the lovely Frances Cleveland doing her part.
That's just it. That's going to bring us to Edith Wilson. Now, Edith wrote in her memoirs that Dr. Francis Dercum told her that, quote, "For Mr. Wilson to resign would have a bad effect on the country and a serious effect on our patient. To spare Wilson the burdens of office while he recovered, Dr. Dercum told Edith, quote, 'Have everything come to you. Weight the importance of each matter, and see if it is possible by consultation with the respective heads of the departments to solve them without the guidance of your husband.
Yeah, our listeners recall, of course, we're talking about President Wilson's stroke when his condition was not really disclosed to the public, or
It was a very serious stroke, and they kept it under wraps as best they could.
Edith and Joseph Tumblety, the presidential secretary, and Dr. Grayson, the three of them, kind of taking charge of the president. And as Edith would later write, quote, I studied every paper sent from the different secretaries or senators and tried to digest and present in tabloid form the things that, despite my vigilance, had to go to the president. I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband. He asked thousands of questions and insisted on knowing everything, particularly about the Treaty of Versailles.
That's it. Edith Wilson finding herself in an unprecedented position of an incapacitated president and, well, trying to cover it up.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, she was the most influential and powerful First Lady during that time.
Yeah?
Maybe for good or ill. I'd say that era of the Wilson presidency was one of the more eras of a lapse in presidential leadership, which, I mean, you have to expect when the president is incapacitated.
That's it.
Edith keeping the car on the road,
Well, pretty
so
much,
to
yeah.
speak.
I mean, and, you know, that in and of itself garners her an honorable mention here.
It's not her decision whether Wilson should resign or not, and
Right.
it's not really up to her whether to hide this from the public.
Resignation is the furthest thing from his mind. He wants another term.
Right. I mean, she did what she thought was best to protect her husband, which was probably the best job that anyone could have done to protect him in that situation. Whether it would have been best for the country for him to resign, who knows? But Edith stepped up to the plate.
That's it.
Some refer to her as the first female president.
Right. Well, that's going to bring us to Grace Coolidge. You'll remember a little bit about Grace Coolidge from our most recent episode on Calvin Coolidge. Grace Coolidge said, quote, there was a sense of detachment. This was I and not yet I. This was the wife of the President of the United States, and she took precedence over me. My personal likes and dislikes must be subordinated to the consideration of those things which were required of her. It's an interesting way to look at it. Mm-hmm. Grace Coolidge, another one, whose image makes her exceedingly popular. She kind of has that Francis Cleveland, Jackie Kennedy thing going on. She kind of exemplifies the Roaring Twenties. She is the ideal First Lady of the time. And another thing that we've talked about many times here is the personal contrast between her and her husband. Mm-hmm. Silent Cal and the ebullient and vivacious Grace Coolidge.
Yeah, somehow a lot of these presidents who are really not personally charismatic end up with great wives who make up for that for them.
And sometimes it works the opposite way, like with Pierce and Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mary Lincoln and Jane Pierce, not on this list.
That's right, but they're on a different top 5.
That's true.
The most tragic First Ladies. Back to Grace Coolidge, who, she suffered some tragedy with the loss of a son whilst First Lady, and she had to try and remain stoic through that and still carry on her role as the First Lady of the nation. Coolidge would write in his autobiography, quote, for almost a quarter of a century, she has borne with my infirmities, and I have rejoiced in her graces. Great presidential couple is Grace and Calvin Coolidge.
Mm-hmm. She was a grace of many graces.
That's just it. And that's going to bring us to Hillary Clinton. Quite an accomplished First Lady. holding the post of, post First Lady,
Yeah.
holding the post of Secretary of State, and mounting an unsuccessful campaign for president in her own right. As First Lady, she had to deal with quite a bit.
Yeah, I think she definitely is unrivaled in the realm of post-First Lady accomplishments, and perhaps even unrivaled compared to any American woman in terms of her own personal political accomplishments. And as First Lady, kind of picking up where Eleanor left off and kind of,
Trying to champion a cause.
yeah, moving the ball forward in terms of the involvement of a First Lady
Right.
in political affairs. Her husband named her the chair of the committee to develop a new healthcare law, and she was intimately involved in that ultimately unsuccessful effort.
Yeah.
And I think even she later said that it was probably a mistake for her to be the
Be as
face
involved yeah.
face of that.
Right.
But she was very involved in a lot of things. She went to the UN World Conference on Women in 1995 and famously said, quote, "If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, once and for all."
There you have it. You also had, not yet president at the time, Donald Trump, saying in 2008, "Well, I think her history is far from being over. I think she's going to go down at a minimum as a great senator. I think she is a great wife to a president." There you go. Donald Trump calling Hillary Clinton a great senator and a great wife to a president.
He would later change his tune.
Just a little bit. And that's going to bring us to Michelle Obama.
That's right. Barack Obama said of his wife, quote, "Now you may have noticed I'm married to a very strong and talented woman. Michelle is not afraid to speak her mind or tell me when I'm wrong, which happens frequently."
Yeah, Michelle Obama, as well as her husband, pretty popular.
Yeah.
In terms of the media and everything. And of course, Michelle Obama, she championed the cause of physical fitness.
That's right. Getting healthier school lunches.
Right?
Michelle Obama, she graduated from Princeton and Harvard Law School, and kind of similar to Hillary Clinton in terms of her level of education.
Yeah.
Hillary, Yale Law School.
Yeah.
Both of them with legal careers before they become First Lady. Michelle maybe a little more skilled as First Lady of...
She wasn't
Not-
quite as divisive.
Right. She didn't, Hillary maybe got out a little bit too far ahead of herself, as she herself later admitted.
Yeah.
Michelle really maintaining a great balance.
Indeed. At the 2016 Democratic National Convention, Michelle said, quote, "I realized that our time in the White House would form the foundation for who our daughters would become, and how well we managed this experience could truly make or break them. That is what Barack and I think about every day as we try to guide and protect our girls through the challenges of this unusual life in the spotlight, how we urge them to ignore those who question their father's citizenship or faith, how we insist that the hateful language they hear from public figures on TV does not represent the true spirit of this country, how we explain that when someone is cruel or acts like a bully, you don't stoop to their level. No, our motto is, when they go low, we go high. With every word we utter, with every action we take, we know our kids are watching us. We as parents are their most important role models. And let me tell you, Barack and I take that same approach to our jobs as President and First Lady, because we know that our words and actions matter, not just to our girls, but the children across this country. Kids who tell us, I saw you on TV. I wrote a report on you for school. And that was a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, that's Michelle speaking at a national convention that would nominate a former First Lady to run for president.
That's it. She maybe outshone Hillary a little bit with that statement.
Well, and she was pretty successful at taking a little subtle dig at Hillary's opponent.
Yeah.
And yet couched it in very idealistic terms.
Indeed. Some great first ladies.
And there have been plenty of other great first ladies. If we missed one whom you cherish, let us know in the comments.
That's it. But that's going to bring us to the end of our top 5 this week. We're sure to be back with some more exciting top 5s in the future. As always, for the Dead Presidents Podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
I'm James J. Hamilton.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.